There is a lot of debate over what defines a hack and slash game, and within that definition there is a genre sometimes called the character action game, or spectacle fighter. It's a genre that I very much enjoy, with fast-paced 3D action, over-the-top visuals, and an emphasis on creating extreme combos. Without getting too caught up in definitions, you guys know what games I'm talking about here, right? Your Devil May Cry's, Bayonettas, Metal Gear Risings, and Ninja Gaidens of the world. There's a common thread between all of these games that I just mentioned. Do you see it? All of these games were developed by Japanese studios. The character action game, at least in its infancy, was very much dominated by the East. They've given us a lot of great games, but the Japanese way of storytelling in video games is very different from the Western way. The Japanese style is usually eccentrically over the top, often nonsensical, and unapologetically gamey. And that's where God of War steps in to shake things up. Developed by Santa Monica Studios, a first-party studio under Sony, in 2005. This was one of, if not the, first major attempt the West made at a spectacle fighter, and even 13 years later, it is a tremendous success. God of War follows a mortal known as Kratos. We begin seeing Kratos teetering back and forth on the edge of the greatest mountain in all of Greece, before eventually throwing himself off of it. Just as Kratos is about to meet the rocks below, we flash back and uncover more of the story about what got him in that position. The tragedy of Kratos is dished out to us in pieces throughout the adventure, but I'm going to outline all of it here. I'll be spoiling the entirety of God of War 1, so return to this video after you've completed the game if spoilers bother you. Kratos was one of the most powerful soldiers in all of Sparta, who worked his way up to a leadership role within the army. A particularly fierce battle against a barbarian horde found Kratos and his men grossly outnumbered. Just as Kratos was about to die, he called upon Ares, the god of war, to help him power through this battle. In exchange, Kratos pledged his eternal servitude to the god.
Ares! Destroy my enemies, and my life is yours.
That desperate call for aid would come to haunt Kratos for all his days.
Ares agreed and destroyed all of Kratos' enemies. Ares gave Kratos his infamous Blades of Chaos. The chains on the weapon simultaneously give Kratos the ability to attack foes no matter how great the distance, but are also a prison that bind the weapons to Kratos' flesh. Now, an instrument of the god of war, Kratos kills all of Ares' enemies. Until a fateful night when, in his blind rage, Kratos mistakenly kills his own family. Their ashes and blood permanently dye his flesh, and the events haunt Kratos in the form of nightmares for the rest of his life. From that day forward, Kratos vows to work for Ares no longer and seeks to take his revenge. I use the word tragedy very deliberately when mentioning Kratos' backstory, not only because of Kratos' downfall, but because of how closely the pacing of this game matches the act and structure of a Grecian tragedy. Kratos was a character made up for the purposes of the game, and is not actually a part of the mythological Greek pantheon, though I think this fact may fool many, just because of how well executed and believable Kratos' story is for a myth.
Ares, you will die for what you did that night.
Playing through the God of War made me feel like I was playing through a Greek myth being orated to me by the narrator, and that feeling is one of God of War's greatest assets. It's part of the reason why I mentioned all those Japanese games before, because despite how great some of them are, I don't think anyone out there is praising their narratives. What those games are being praised for is their gameplay, and thankfully, the more grounded narrative in God of War doesn't come at the cost of gameplay. Kratos has a few different tools at his disposal to handle the hordes of enemies that will show up on screen. The star of the show are the Blades of Chaos, whose bright colors fill the screen as you sweep across it, cleaving through enemy upon enemy. There's an insane fluidity to Kratos' attacks that is so elegant it often feels like you're painting with a brush rather than striking with a blade. There's an alternate heavy weapon that can be used as well, plus 4 different spells that run off of a magic meter. All of these are beautifully contextualized within the game's universe, such as using a Gorgon's decapitated head to freeze enemies, and Zeus's thunderbolts to snipe foes at range. The fights all take place within fixed camera angles, which frees up the right analog stick to be used as a dodge button, as well as preventing the need for a lock-on system. It's hard to keep talking about how great the combat is. There really aren't a whole lot of talking points that I have other than it just feels so good. There's an appropriate sense of weight to everything you do, the animations are spot on, there's good enemy variety both in terms of visuals and gameplay, it's just excellent. You always feel like you have multiple options for fighting, whether that be heavy attacks, light attacks, throws, or one of your spells. What's more impressive about all of this is how the game attempts to give you a variety of options even outside of your traditional room-based battles. If you're climbing horizontally across a rope, you still have access to quick jabs, heavy sweeps, and throws. Climbing up a net, you guessed it, quick jabs, heavy sweeps, and throws are all at your disposal. And of course, mid-air you have tons of different ways to juggle your opponents. The one blemish on an otherwise incredible combat system is the reliance on quick time events, specifically button mashing. Occasionally your foes will have a circle button over their head, denoting that casting the throw button on them will begin one of these timed events. Sometimes just getting the QTE started is a pain, especially when you're trying to use the circle button on a specific enemy, though you're fighting a dozen at a time. But man, the button mashing, it's used so frequently here. For example, getting a Minotaur at low health and using throw will allow you to spam circle to drive your blade through its skull and get rewarded with some health. But despite the boon it provides, I found myself often ignoring that option just because my hand couldn't handle any more mashing. I think that these could have been removed from the game entirely, or replaced with a single held button press to denote the continuous force that you're placing on the enemy. Hell, they're even used outside of combat, like for opening doors. I get what they were going for, but it feels really excessive. In addition to fighting droves of small enemies, there are a few set-piece boss battles that are some serious high points for the game. They share the same quick time problem that the regular fights have, but otherwise, they're incredibly fun with an awesome sense of scale. Despite the fact that God of War is insanely combat heavy, that's not the only thing you're going to be doing. It has a few different ways it paces itself in between combat, the most notable of which being the puzzles. I really liked the overwhelming majority of these. They all felt solvable without a guide, despite never getting too easy. There is a problem that is pervasive among them, however, which is the execution of solving the puzzles sometimes taking longer than thinking through the puzzle does. Take a look at this one. From the moment I entered this room and saw the turntable, it was pretty apparent what needed to be done. Push the blocks up against the wall in the proper configuration. Though I had a good idea of where each block needed to go, actually pushing the blocks into place took an insanely large amount of time. There's an ability to push the blocks with a kick to make it go a little bit faster, but it's not nearly enough. Perhaps a single puzzle like this could exist to help emphasize how hard the physical task is on Kratos himself, but nearly every single puzzle in the game has this problem. I also feel the need to praise the puzzles for feeling really well integrated into the world. They feel believable and well placed, like the many labyrinths within Pandora's Tower, and hell, there's even a few combat puzzles in Hades' domain that will have you killing enemies in certain areas to activate effects. The only place where this integration doesn't feel fully realized is in Athens. Solving the many challenges the gods impose on adventurers to get to Pandora's box feels appropriate, but solving random box puzzles on the streets of Athens just doesn't. Athens is core to the story of God of War, and where a good chunk of the game will be held. Ares is laying siege to Athens because of his envy of Athena. Athena promises to absolve Kratos of sin if he destroys Ares for him, and she acts as the narrator on your quest. Not ready to take on Ares at the start of the game, you travel the world in search of weapons and artifacts that will power you up before your final fight. The levels you journey through are actually a single unified world. Though there may be a second or two where the game loads upon entering a new area, the context that this interconnected world gives does wonders for the game's atmosphere. Traveling from Athens and journeying through the desert actually feels like a journey through the desert, and not just an area that you loaded into. Though originally released on the PS2, this is the PS3 re-release that I'm playing here. The game still looks and sounds stunning, though the models don't quite hold up from up close. You'll never be seeing them that way because of the fixed camera angles. There's just one small nitpick with this PS3 version, and that's the in-game cutscenes. The action is often interlaced with cutscenes, and the cutscenes themselves didn't make the jump to HD like the rest of the game does. It's pretty jarring going back and forth between the two styles in a way that probably would have been less noticeable on the original hardware. The impossibly strong story of this game gets cemented in the final act. Upon finding Pandora's box, the final gift that was needed to defeat Ares, Kratos gets struck down by the god of war himself and sent to hell before he can activate the box's powers. Not even death can stop Kratos, and you have to claw your way out of Hades to enact your revenge. There's a really specific platforming challenge here that sucks, and it's scaling this wall. There are a few different platforming pieces of this game. Most of them are tame and don't feel too out of place, but this one here, this spinning cylinder here, is the real hell. I spent somewhere in the range of 10 to 15 minutes trying to climb this thing, only to get hit by a spike and fall down. It feels insanely challenging, but not in a good way. Let's keep the challenge on the boss fights, please. Speaking of boss fights, Ares awaits when you finally claw your way out of hell. You get scaled up to take on your old master, but the real challenge Kratos must face here is his past. The halfway point of the battle sees you struggling to save your family from yourself, to no avail. Though your family may never be saved, you do manage to kill Ares in the end. But this is where the gods reveal their final deception to Kratos. Athena informs Kratos that, despite fulfilling her wishes, she can never remove the nightmares Kratos is plagued with. With this knowledge, Kratos knows the only way to escape from his madness is through death. And back we are at the beginning of the game, where he throws himself from the mountain. His death gets prevented by Athena, who elevates Kratos to the newly vacant position of God of War. And that's the game. You may experience the journey again on hard mode that unlocks, but I had plenty of enjoyment out of my one playthrough. God of War is fantastic, and I don't know what took me so long to play it. Kratos' Faustian bargain with Ares is a perfectly realized plot that feels so well woven into the gameplay, and one that I won't be forgetting anytime soon.
The fate of Kratos was not as it seemed. The gods had other plans. Borne aloft like a feather, Kratos found himself risen from the sea and placed on solid earth.
You will not die this day, Kratos. The gods cannot allow one who has performed such service to perish by his own hand.